Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again. In this video, we're going to be talking about the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. Now, this is a text that's caused a lot of controversy, and there's been a lot of debate over this text. Some people have suggested that the sons of God, the term sons of God, refers to angels that came down and married these daughters of men and had sexual relations with them, giving birth to some type of a hybrid race and things like that. And none of that's true. Of course, the Bible says that angels neither marry nor are given in marriage, and that term given in marriage means to have sexual relations. So that's, it's just ludicrous. And not only that, but it starts right in Genesis chapter 6. And this text is found in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, but you can't just completely ignore the entire historical context leading up to Genesis chapter 6. So let's just begin by reading Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, and then we'll go back and we'll take a look at what's going on in the historical context and see if we can't shed a little light on this subject. So in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1 it says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all, which they chose." So this term, sons of men or sons of God marrying daughters of men, we have to look at the historical context. We're in Genesis chapter 6 right now, and we know that the book of Genesis starts with the story of creation, and then as we get into Genesis chapter 3, we have the fall of man, Adam and Eve's sin, and they tried to get out of their sin dilemma, right, by sewing fig leaves together and creating these aprons and to cover up their nakedness that way. But of course, God rejected the work of their hands and said, you guys can't solve your own sin problem. And he sacrificed an animal, and they were clothed with the skins of the sacrifice. So that's probably where Adam and Eve learned sacrifice, to offer sacrifice to God. And this is what we find in Genesis chapter 4 as we proceed right along. In Genesis chapter 4, Adam's sons, Cain and Abel, are offering sacrifice to the Lord. And Cain offered the work of his hands. Cain is the firstborn son, so he had the rights to the inheritance and everything like that, all the privileges that go along with being the firstborn son. He was the first person ever to be born, which is kind of interesting. But he was a tiller of the ground, which is to say that he was a farmer. And his brother Abel was a pastor of the sheep. Abel offered the fattest of the flock to the Lord as his sacrifice or his offering. And the Bible says that the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. But when we turn over to Cain, Cain offered the work of his hands, which is to say one of the crops that he had planted, and the Lord did not have respect for his offering, and the Lord got upset with his offering. So Cain got mad and his countenance fell. And what did he do? He killed his brother Abel. Cain slew Abel, and Abel's blood cried out to the Lord from the ground. And God said to Cain, "What have you done?" And he put a mark on Cain so that no one would be able to kill him, and that Cain would have to live with what he had done for the rest of his life. And he sent him out to be a fugitive and a vagabond on the face of the earth. And he had this mark that he had to live with, and God was going to protect him, because you have to understand, God wanted Cain to go out and multiply and populate the earth, even though Cain he's become the bastard son of Adam through this transgression, through this sin. When he killed his brother Abel, he was cast out as a fugitive and a vagabond to roam on the face of the earth like that. And you have to understand that this is right in line with a principle in the biblical lands, and even in the nation of Israel. They had what was called the Book of Life, and this was basically just like a civil registry, just like we have in the modern world. Whenever a baby is born, he has a birth certificate in the city hall or your town hall, and you have to file that. And the hospital probably does it for you right at the baby's birthday, and the paperwork is done, and there's a record of all the births, and that's an ancient custom going back to Israel and all of the biblical lands in and around the times of Christ. This was called a book of the living, or a book of life. And whenever someone would die, their name would be blotted out of that book of life. In other cases, when someone would bring shame upon their family name, they could be excommunicated or cast out of the entire country, the entire nation, and they'd have to go into a different country to live. And much like Cain, they'd become a fugitive and a vagabond upon the face of the earth. You can look these things up in Bible dictionaries and in encyclopedias and things like that. McClintock and Strong talks about the military roll call, and when someone was dishonorably discharged, he would also have his name blotted out of their book of life, which pertained to the military and things like that. We see this in 1 Samuel 17 in verse 12. It talks about Jesse, the father of King David, having 8 sons. And then when you turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 13 to 15, it names 7 sons. And people will say, well, that's a contradiction in the Bible, and look at this. The Bible's not true, it's not inerrant and all this. And well, no, maybe it's just someone's understanding that has a problem, because if we take into account the book of life, and that someone can be blotted out of the book of life, that would account for it. So if someone brings shame upon their family name, they're cast out and they have their name written out, blotted out of the book of life. That's what we're seeing going on with Cain. He becomes a bastard child of Adam, just an illegitimate son, loses his inheritance, and he's cast out to be a fugitive and a vagabond upon the face of the earth. But God put this mark upon him so that no one would kill him, and that he'd have to live with what he had done, and he's going to go on to populate the earth, become the father of all the pagan Gentile nations. People, they don't always understand the truth about God. Why would God want this murderer, this Cain, this wicked man to go out and populate the earth and things like that? And people will say, or they'll try to say that Adam had free will in the Garden of Eden, and that it wasn't God's will for Adam to sin. And they don't understand that even all of the evil and everything like that in the world is all part of God's plan. God's in control of everything. This is the sovereignty of God we're talking about. So no, Adam didn't have free will in the Garden of Eden, because think about it. John chapter 17 talks about a covenant made between God the Father and God the Son in eternity past, that Christ would take on a human body. It's talking about the incarnation, that he would go to the cross and that he would pay for sin, that he would pay for the sin of his predestinated elect family, and that God the Father would present to him a bride for his sufferings. And that bride comes in the form of the church, which is to say spiritual Israel, all the believers, all the children of God throughout the whole history or course of time. It also refers to Christ as the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So how can we have all of these things? God making all of these decrees to save a family from sin. The Bible teaches that we're predestined for salvation, and from before the foundation of the world. So, and it teaches in Acts chapter 4 that even the crucifixion of Christ, the most heinous sin in the whole history of the world, was also decreed by the hand and the counsel of God. So when we know all these things, that God has predestinated a family for himself that will be presented to Christ as a bride, in that the crucifixion of Christ was predestined, how then can we say that Adam had free will in the Garden of Eden? If Adam had free will and didn't have to sin, that he could keep himself from sinning, that would give Adam the power. That would have given Adam the power to thwart and just utterly frustrate the divine decrees and the will of God. And Adam does not have that power. He never did have that power. None of us have that power. If you don't believe me, just read Daniel chapter 4, verse 35, or Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 through 11. God's counsel will stand, and he will do all his pleasure. That's what's being done. God has decreed all the evil and everything that we see on the earth. God is sovereign over all creation, and his will is being done. It was his will for Cain to go out and be the father of all these pagan Gentile nations, and that's exactly what we see. Because as soon as Cain's cast out to be a fugitive and a vagabond on the face of the earth, as soon as we get into the latter half of Genesis chapter 4, we find a lineage, which are the descendants of Cain. And you can only trace that lineage back to Cain. It doesn't go back to Adam, because he's the illegitimate son of Adam. He's the bastard son of Adam. And he's not a child of God either. That's why in the latter half of Genesis chapter 4, that lineage or that descendancy starts with Cain. And it goes from Cain to Enoch, Irad, Meuhael, Methusael, Lamech, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. Those are the descendants of Cain as appear in Genesis chapter 4. As we turn the page over and get into Genesis chapter 5, in verse 1, it talks about a godly lineage. Now these are the sons of God, because God is named, and then it says that he created Adam. So if we turn over to Genesis 5 and verse 1, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him." So it's talking about God creating man, Adam. Both God and Adam are named, and then it goes on to give the list of the descendants of Adam, starting with Seth. It doesn't say Abel because Cain slew Abel, and Adam knew his wife Eve again, and she conceived and bare a son whose name was Seth. Seth in the Hebrew means substitute. So Seth is the substitute for Abel. That's why his name doesn't appear in the genealogy. And it goes God, Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. And that's the list of the godly lineage. That's the chosen, predestinated, elect family. That's the seed. That's the family that's going to go on to become the nation of Israel. This is the godly lineage. Now, what we're seeing when we get to Genesis chapter 6, that's just one chapter over. So this is the historical context. We have Adam falls into sin. We have his children, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel when they were offering their sacrifices. And then we find the lineage of the ungodly seed, which is Cain, and the godly seed of Adam and Seth. And then when it gets into talking about the sons of God, that's right after. It just gave the genealogy of Adam's descendancy, Cain being the bastard son. So the sons of God is that godly lineage mixing with the ungodly descendants of Cain. Cain's the fathers of all unbelieving Gentiles. And believers are to be holy. This is what we're told in the scriptures, that we're not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And this is a theme that we see throughout all the scriptures. This mixing that we see in Genesis chapter 6 brought the judgment of God upon the people. And this is why God sent the flood, and only 8 people were saved in the ark during that flood, Noah and his family. So this sin of mixing the godly line with the ungodly line is what brought the judgment of God. And this is a theme that we see all through the Old Testament scriptures. There were basically 2 main sins that the Israelites committed against God over and over again throughout the Old Testament. One is that they never recognized or they never observed the sabbatical years of rest for the land. Every 7th year was supposed to be a sabbatical year for the land. They weren't supposed to plant any crops, and they weren't supposed to reap the harvest. They're supposed to let it rest so that the fruit that was on the vines would just rot off the vines and fall to the ground, and then just rot on the ground and go into the soil and replenish the soil, and all the vitamins and minerals and nutrients that were in the fruit would then replenish and revitalize the soil so that it would have a time to rest, replenish itself, and that the next year when they came to plant again, the soil would be good and be full of minerals and vitamins and nutrients, and that it would yield great crops again the following year. But the Jews were greedy, and they said, you know what, we don't want to take a year off. We want to keep working. We want to plant, and we want to reap the harvest. We want our storehouses and our baskets to be full. So they didn't want to trust God. They never did observe that sabbatical year of rest for the land. The other major sin that brought the judgment of God and the punishment of God upon the nation of Israel was that they always were mixing with their pagan neighbors. God told them. You have to understand. So after the flood, you can go over to Genesis chapter 11, and we can pick up with that genealogy again. So after the flood, we have Noah coming out of the ark, and God makes his covenant with Shem. It says, blessed be the Lord God of Shem. And then Shem has his descendants continue. There's another genealogy in Genesis chapter 11. And in Genesis chapter 11, it talks about Shem, Arphaxad, Selah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and finally Abram. in Abram's name was changed to Abraham. In Abraham, God made his covenant with Abraham. The sign of the covenant was the circumcision. And then Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac, of course, gets the covenant. God loved Isaac. Isaac had two sons, twins, Jacob and Esau. And it says that the elder shall serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, and Jacob gets the covenant. So we're seeing that through the descendants, Noah and then Shem, his son, and then we see Arphaxad, and right on down the line to Abraham, and then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Israel was a man that wound up having a family, and that family went to live in Egypt, and then they became enslaved in Egypt, but the whole time they were just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. They wound up living in slavery and bondage in Egypt for approximately 400 years until God took them out by his mighty hand. They wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years before they entered into that promised land, and they became a nation in that promised land. But as they were preparing to enter into the promised land, God spoke to the Israelites, the Hebrews, and he said, now when you go into that promised land, I want you to drive out all the inhabitants of the land, and I want you to break down all their pictures and their molten images, and I want you to destroy their high places and all their idols and their idolatry and everything like that. So their high places, that's their altars where they were offering sacrifices to their false gods. They were worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars. That's Baal in the grove and all these false gods of the ancient world, and they were worshiping the creation and the things that they imagined and all that, just pure idolatry. And God said, I don't want you making leagues with them. I want you to go into the land. I want you to utterly drive them out. But we read in Judges chapter 1 that they did not utterly drive them out. They failed to drive them out of the land, and they did make leagues with them. So God said, okay, if that's the way you want to do it, then I'll have them to be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your side. And that's exactly what they were all through the Old Testament. They were thorns in their side. The Jews continuously went after the false gods of their pagan neighbors, and that's what Judges chapter 2 tells us, that they failed to utterly drive them out, and that they went a-whoring after the false gods of all these pagan people that they didn't drive out of the land. So those are the two major sins that we see the Jews committing over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament. They didn't ever observe the Sabbath year of rest for the land every seventh year, and they mixed and mingled with the pagans, and they took them for their wives, and they did all these things where they would offer sacrifice to their gods and burn incense to their gods and do all this stuff. So those are the sins that brought the judgment of God upon the nation of Israel, and that's what we're seeing in Genesis chapter 6. It's the beginning of a biblical theme. The sons of God, that predestinated, chosen, elect line of saints, mixed with the daughters of men. That's the descendants of Cain, the ungodly Cain. Cain's the father of all the unbelieving Gentiles, those who are Gentiles in the flesh, those that are not ordained to be born again by the Spirit of God, those that are not a part of spiritual Israel. So we're seeing in Genesis chapter 6 that mixing and mingling of the godly line with the ungodly descendants of Cain. And this is, as I said, a biblical theme, as God has called us to be separate and to be holy, and not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So I hope that can shed a little bit of light onto the subject, and I hope that clarifies the subject of the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you the next time.